Greetings everyone. Today I will be taking a topic on disaster management. I'm Dr. Vijayashree and I'm an assistant professor in Department of Community Medicine. So first let us look at the definition of disaster. Any occurrence that causes damage, ecological disruption, loss of human life or deterioration of health and health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside the affected area is called a disaster. So this is a plain English sentence which is explaining that there is damage to ecological disruption, that is that the environment is damaged and the human life is disrupted and the health is affected, and it is affected at such a scale that it is warranting that is we will need an extraordinary response from outside the affected area. That is what is a disaster. Now coming to the definition of hazard, we have to know the definition of hazard and disaster separately, and it's an important viva question. Once you answer what is a disaster, they will ask you if you know what is a hazard or not. So hazard is nothing but a phenomenon that has the potential to cause disruption or damage to the people and their environment. So hazard is the having the potential of disrupting the people or the environment. Now disasters are not confirmed to confined to a particular part of the world. It is actually confined to a particular part of the world. They occur anywhere in the world and they can occur at any time. According to the statistics, since 1969, vulnerability of the population to disaster is continuously growing. Now let us look at different types of disasters. We all know the examples of disasters. They can be earthquakes, cyclones, and they can be fires, they can be floods, hurricanes, and tidal waves can be there, collapse in buildings, and chemical accidents, warfare, and nuclear warfare, and famines, heavy heat waves, and snowstorms, volcanic eruptions. These are all mostly the ones that I've put up in this slide are natural disasters. I will explain to you in due time what is man-made disaster. Now this is just a picture that is showing how destructive a earthquake can be. Now an earthquake is associated with very high level of mortality, and the night time, if there is an earthquake, then the deaths are more because most of the people are indoors and they are not aware of the impending damage or the impending danger. So the deaths and morbidities are more in an earthquake which occurs at night. And then coming to fires, forest fires and fires everywhere else in the human habitations can be disasters. Volcanic eruptions, and volcanic eruptions can cause injuries, they can cause burns, and they can cause suffocation related deaths. Now, these are some examples of the major volcanic eruptions that happened in the history, and this is a picture of the bus that I put up to show that there was a flash flood and a school bus is being carried away by very, very, strong, forceful water. And this is a picture of tsunami waves which can rise up to, very, where they come and hit the shore very strongly, and they rise to a very height, big level. And now winds, when they are confined, they are combined with heavy rains, will lead to cyclones and hurricanes, and they are very destructive, and they destroy everything that comes in their way. And mostly these are predicted well in advance, and those areas are evacuated. And then there can be in a country like ours, there can be droughts and there can be famines, so when there are not enough rainfalls, and it can lead to malnutrition because the people are not getting food in due time, and nutrition is also hampered. Vitamin deficiencies can happen, and diseases like measles and diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections can happen, and most affected are infants, and infant mortality will rise. Now, like I said, man-made disasters. The man-made disasters can be classified into the ones that are sudden and the ones that are insidious, slow onset. So sudden ones, examples can be Bhopal gas tragedy that you must have heard, and it occurred way back in 1984. It occurred on 3rd of December, and methyl isocyanate cyanate is the culprit. This was a chemical that led to this tragedy, and around 2 million people were exposed, and 3,000 people lost their lives. Then one more example of the sudden man-made disaster is the Chernobyl nuclear power station accident that happened, and radioactive materials were leaked into the atmosphere. Coming to the insidious man-made disasters, chemical exposure or radiation exposure, and global warming. Global warming, everybody is aware of global warming. Global warming itself can be a form of cancer. global warming, all these things are examples of insidious man-made disasters. That is, they are slow and they are present. The reasons for these man-made disasters are present for a long time, and they will cause their effects slowly. And global warming, as we all know, is because of burning the fossil fuel and depletion of the ozone layers and emission of the chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere. Now, coming to the next man-made disaster, wars and civil conflicts, like World War I and II, everybody is aware of. Those led to a major human life loss. So those also are counted as human your man-made disasters. And types of morbidities that result because of various disasters. Injuries will happen naturally because humans are involved. Injuries will be there, and there is a lot of emotional stress attached after the disaster and while the disaster. And epidemics will happen. Disease outbreaks will be there soon after the disaster, and there will be insidious diseases. There will be increase in the already prevailing diseases that are there in that particular community which is hit by the disaster. Now, coming to a country like India, because we have very wide range of topography and the climatic conditions are also very, very varied from one part to another part of the country. Uh, the disasters are very different. What happens in south, east and west and north and south is the various different types of natural disasters can happen. So common disasters in India are listed in this particular slide. They can be floods, cyclones, they can be droughts, they can be earthquakes, and epidemics can happen. Major diseases, which when there is epidemic outbreaks, those can happen, and accidents in railway, lines and mines and factories have been occurring. Now and then. And then these are some pictures that are showing the accidents, and there is famine, there is floods, and there is railway accident. The slide shows all the types of disasters. Now, coming to the northern and northeastern hill states of India, their earthquakes and landslides are more common, and coming to the eastern coast of India, floods and cyclones are more common. Coming to the western desert areas, their drought is more common. And Bihar, Assam, UP, these are all states which are very frequently affected by major floods. More or less every other year there is a flood in these states. And in Odisha, like everybody knows, there was super cyclone. It happened in 1999. And in Gujarat, there was an earthquake, and around 16,000 people lost their lives. And the pesticide plant, Chernobyl and Bhopal gas tragedy, these happened in the MP. Now, coming to the disaster management. This disaster management has a scope for you to get an essay. They will just ask you to write an essay on disaster management, where you will have to, quickly define disaster and hazard, and then you have to, classify the man-made and natural disasters, and also write about the disaster management. There is a cycle that I'll be showing you in the coming slides, and you have to write about all the 3 steps that are there in the cycle, and also you have to write about the precautions that you will take before, during and after the major disasters. So this is how your essay will flow. And individually, any of the small parts of the disaster cycle, like either the disaster response or disaster preparedness or disaster mitigation, can in itself be a short answer for your exam. So you please pay attention to this topic from here on. So there are 3 fundamental aspects in disaster management. One is disaster response, then followed by preparedness, and then there is followed by mitigation. Now, this is what I was talking about, is a disaster cycle. You can see that small, speech bubble, which is showing disaster impact. That is where the disaster happens. From there on, you please follow the arrows where there is response, followed by rehabilitation, followed by reconstruction. Then there is disaster mitigation, then there is preparedness, then again you will be prepared for the disaster, and then the next impact happens. So you can see that the cycle has been divided into 2 aspects by the rectangles that are shown in the figure. There, where there's phase of, after disaster, and there is a risk reduction phase which happens before the disaster, and recovery phase that happens after the disaster. So the cycle has been broadly classified into 2 equal halves. So this is about the disaster cycle. You were expected to draw this particular diagram if the answer happens in your exam, and you will score more marks than the person who do not draw the diagram. Then this is the impact and response slide of the disaster management. So the management of mass casualties can be divided into search and rescue operations, first aid that is carried out in the field, and there is something called as triage and stabilization of the victims. and the hospital treatment and redistribution of the patients to other hospitals. So what happens when the disaster impact happens? You have to immediately respond to the impact, and what immediately happens after the disaster is, when things settle down, then the rescue teams will come into the picture and they will do something called as a search and rescue operation. They will search for people who are being injured and people who are dead and who need immediate help. They will be rescued, and first aid will be done. The first and foremost thing is the first aid will be done, and there's something called as triage and stabilization of the victims. Now, search, rescue operations and first aid. This slide is saying us that after a major disaster, most immediate help comes from the uninjured survivors. So basically, whenever there is a disaster that happens, immediate help is the person who is not injured, and he was in the disaster but was not injured. So he is the immediate help. Then organized relief services will meet only a small fraction of the demand. So no matter how much relief services we have in store, they will meet only a small fraction of the demand after the disaster. Then there's something called as field care. How do you handle the field of a disaster? If you are the medical officer looking after the camp, disaster rescue camp, how do you take care of the field? Then you have to make sure that the beds are available and surgical services are available, and even if they are available, they have to be increased to their maximum capacity so that the victims can be admitted, and surgical services, for example, if there are lacerations, they should be soothed, and if there are sharp objects that have penetrated into any body part, those have to be removed. So surgical services and basic bed availability and casualty services have to be maximized, and provision for food and shelter have to be arranged. Apart from the medical services, you should also take care of the shelter and the food availability for the victims, and the center to respond to the injuries from inquiries from the patient's relatives and friends. So you have to set up a desk which is called as an inquiry desk, where uninjured relatives from other areas, they will pour in there. They'll start calling, they will start visiting the site, and they will start inquiring about their near and dear ones if they are in your rescue camp. So you have to set up an inquiry desk for that, and priority should be given to the victims to victims identification, and adequate mortuary space has to be provided. So when you see that the person is deceased or dead because of the particular disaster, you have to put them in a proper secluded area, because otherwise they will contaminate the surroundings, and the bodies might or bodies or body parts might contaminate the groundwater or the flowing river that is there nearby. So you have to seclude them separately, and you have to place them properly. And whenever the victims are coming and asking for their relatives bodies, you have to hand over the right person's body to their right belonging people. So all that is also a separate department that has to be set up. And triage, this is an important term, and it is a very important viva question. Everybody has heard this phrase which is called first come first serve, or first come first treat. This is not applicable to the disaster scene, because we have to prioritize who is going to survive longer, and who is going to recover better with basic minimum care, and we have to give them the highest priority. So highest priority is granted to the victim whose immediate or long-term prognosis can be dramatically affected by simple intensive care. So I hope I'm clear till now what is meant by triage. And people who are moribund and who have very little chances of survival, no matter how much effort you put, and they are very, very severely injured, those will not be your priority. The priority will be little injured and more scope for recovery with a simple simple treatment. And coming to triage should be carried out at the site of disaster in order to determine the transportation priorities and admission to the hospital, and also the treatment center where you're sending them, and patient what and where is the patient needing, and priority of the medical care will be reassessed. So when you're in the field itself, you are doing the triage, and you are classifying people into different color coded categories. Either you're putting them in black or red or green category. Black is the people who are already deceased and dead, and people who are high priority and low priority will be segregated, and based on that you are sending them to another facility where treatment can be provided, and transportation and admission priorities will be given based on the triage. Persons with minor or moderate injuries should be treated at their own homes to avoid social dislocation. So basically what this means is you should not make the disaster site or disaster camp too overcrowded. If they are able to treat themselves, if they are mild or moderate injuries, they can be treated at home without admission. They should be treated there at their homes itself. So that is the meaning of this. And triage, all patients should be identified with tags. So people, after their triage, you have to give them a tag. This is called the tagging, and the tag should carry, they should wear it on their arm where it should be visible, and it should carry their name. It should carry their age and place of origin, and what category of triage they are belonging to, and also the diagnosis and initial treatment that has been administered to the person has to be written on this particular tag. Then there's something called as identification of the dead, and removal of the dead from the disaster scene has to be done, and they have to be shifted to a mortuary, and they have to be identified based on the ID cards that are found on their bodies, or based on the identification marks, and they have to be properly handed over to their relatives. And proper respect for the disease is of great importance. They have to be handled, placed properly in the mortuary and handed over with great respect. And then there's something called as relief phase, which happens after the initial immediate impact of the disaster. The type and quantity of the humanitarian relief supplies are usually determined by two main factors. Then the type of disaster that has happened, and the type of supplies that are available locally. So after each disaster, not the same relief facilities are required. Sometimes when there are, there's a disaster, there's a flood, the requirement will be of food grains and all of that, of the new clothes and blankets and all those things, because food grains have drowned, and they have left their homes, and they do not have anything to keep them warm. So the relief facilities, relief phase, the requirement is different. And if there is another type of disaster, if there is a famine or a drought, so the requirement will be food grains, and they might not require that much of the clothing and blankets and all those things in that particular disaster situation. So based on the disaster, the relief phase resource requirement will be different. It will be varying. Now, immediately following the disaster, most critical health supplies are those needed for treating casualties and preventing the spread of communicable diseases. This sentence is self-explanatory. So whenever there's a emergency, immediate casualties have to be addressed, and there comes the communicable diseases. Those have to be addressed first. Followed by these immediate requirements will come the need for food, the need for blankets, clothing, shelter, sanitation, all these things. And then you have to re-establish the previous state of that particular society. So you will require construction material. So this is the order of priority in which we will require the resources. Now there are four principal components in managing humanitarian supplies. First, whenever there's a disaster and you are the medical officer who is taking care of the disaster camp, you will be receiving funds and other supplies from various sources. So it is your duty to use them properly, store them properly, receive them, use them, and store them properly, and see that it is reaching the people for whom it is meant, and it is reaching in a proper state also. And so you have to first acquire the supplies, acquisition of the supplies, that is called food grains will be coming. So you have to store them in godowns and see that it is not getting spoiled, and again you have to categorize who is requiring the food grains, and again ration it properly, and all these things should be done. Then transportation, you have to transport the resources and give it to the victims, and storage has to be done, and distribution. So everything has to be handled properly. And then there is something called as disaster control. The principle of preventing and controlling communicable diseases after the disaster are as follows. And the public health measures have to be taken to reduce the risk of disaster disease transmission in terms of sanitation, and all those things have to be done. And identify the outbreak. If there is an epidemic outbreak that has happened following the disaster, the epidemic outbreak has to be taken care of. And initial control measures have to be started off, and investigate all the reports of the disease outbreak rapidly. You have to give instructions to all the medical officers about what immediate epidemics could happen, and they have to report back to you if there is any report of outbreak in their particular locality. Then vaccination is required after disaster against typhoid, cholera, and tetanus vaccination also is recommended. And then nutrition. This is an important aspect after a disaster. Immediate step for ensuring that the food relief program should be taken, and assessing the food supplies after the disaster. We have to assess how much is available and what is the requirement that do we have to gauge the nutritional need of the affected population, and then we have to calculate the daily food ration that is required for each and every family, and you have to send supplies. If it's a large group of population, you have to send larger supplies, and small populations you have to send smaller supplies, and each and every family rationing is done. And then monitoring the nutrition status of the affected population has to be done at frequent intervals. Now the next topic, subtopic, is something called as rehabilitation. This is the final phase in the disaster cycle, if you see, and it is nothing but restoration of the pre-disaster conditions. After the disaster, everything has been disrupted, and rehabilitation will help us to re-establish the pre-disaster conditions. In the first week after the disaster, the pattern of health needs will change rapidly. So initially, you are handling the casualties, the dead people, and people who are diseased and all of that, and then later on, after a week or so, you will be more focusing on the routine primary healthcare aspect of the needs. Then there's something called as water supply. The main public safety aspect of water quality is microbiological contamination that happens during disaster that has to be taken care of, and the most easiest and cheapest and effective way of disinfecting water is using chlorination. Now the existing new water supplies require they have to be a fence that has to be erected around the water supply water facility, and you have to appoint a guard who is seeing that who is accessing the water facility, and no contamination should happen, and the people who are defecating also should not defecate upstream, and they have to be put at a proper distance, and no animal husbandry or such animal washing, such things should be encouraged close to this water facility, and you should protect the water source from contamination, and all these things should be done. And if necessary, if the water source is very small and it is catering to a bigger population, you can also look into rationing of the water based on the family size. You have to give this many liters of water from the water facility to that particular family, so rationing also has to be considered. Then comes something called as food safety. Personal hygiene should be monitored in individuals involved in food preparations, and kitchen sanitation is of utmost important. In your disaster camp, whoever is taking care of the kitchen, they have to follow utmost hygienic conditions. Basic sanitation and personal hygiene, emergency latrines have to be erected, and washing, cleaning and bathing facilities should be provided for the people because they have been displaced from their houses. Now vector control, important vectors that we have to keep in mind is the mosquitoes, rats, lice and fleas, and the diseases that are happening because of them, and appropriate the vector control measures have to be taken into consideration. And disaster mitigation in health sector, then mitigation, the meaning of mitigation is in plain English is that you have to manipulate the situation in that way, or you have to change the situation before the mitigation happens in such a way that the disaster altogether doesn't happen, or if it happens also, it is having least impact on the population that is that is being affected by the disaster. So that is the meaning of disaster mitigation. Emergency prevention and mitigation involves measures designed either to prevent the hazard from completely happening or lessen the likely effect of the emergencies, like I already said. And medical casualties can be reduced drastically by improving the structural quality of the houses, schools, and public and private buildings. When your construction quality is only strong, in disaster these buildings will not collapse and cause a lot of injuries and deaths. So construction quality has to be improved. In general, all the construction qualities and construction equipment and rules and regulations have to be followed. And mitigation complements the disaster preparedness as well as disaster response activities. So all the three aspects of disaster cycle, they complement one another. Now, disaster preparedness, the objective is to ensure appropriate system, procedure, and responses are in place to provide prompt, effective assistance to disaster victims, thus facilitating relief measures and rehabilitative services. This doesn't mean it is a very lengthy sentence, but it just means that before the disaster happens itself, you have to anticipate that as and when this particular disaster happens, what all should be in place. For example, if you are making a school building, you have to do something called as disaster mitigation. You have to expect that there might be a fire accident, and what all things need to be in place if and when a fire accident happens. So that you will, this is nothing but a disaster preparedness and a mitigation hand in hand kind of situation, where you keep all the emergency exits and fire extinguishers, and you will do a fire, accident drill. So that is the mitigation part of it. And community members, resources and organization and administration should be the cornerstone of an emergency preparedness program. So members, all the resources should be in place, and administration should be aware of the disasters that could happen, and organizations, they are all a part of the preparedness program. Now, the reasons of community participation. Why is it important for a community to participate whenever there is a disaster? Because these are the members that are the most affected whenever there's a disaster happening in a village. For example, there is an earthquake, those people should be involved in disaster activities, because those are the most affected, as well as they're more vulnerable, and they will be immediately available in the disaster scene for rescue activities also. And first response also in an emergency situation comes from immediately available community members who are not injured. um, and that is about this particular slide. And the tasks to be carried out for a particular disaster preparedness are evaluate the risk of a country or a particular region to the disaster, and adopt standards and regulations that are in place. All the regulations are in place, we just have to put them into order, and we should put them into our regular everyday lives. And organized communication and information and warning system have to be there if there is a flood or a impending earthquake. So you have to communicate the information to the civilians, and ensure coordination and response mechanism in between. Interdepartmental coordination and response mechanism has to be established, and adapt measures to ensure financial and other resources are available. So when you know that the disaster is happening and this much it is going to cost the rehabilitation facility, so you have to keep all the resources like finances and everything in place. Develop the public education program. You have to educate the public well in advance, as and when this disaster happens, what are they supposed to do, which authority to approach. And you have to coordinate with the news media to clearly and transparently send out the news that the public needs to know. Organized disaster simulation exercises have to be carried out. And now we have to, this is the last part of my particular presentation, personal protection in different types of disasters. So the major disasters that can happen, and what the people need to do before it happens, during the particular disaster, and after the disaster happens. So let us see some major ones. This is the disaster cycle. I again put this slide for your reference. So first I said there is response, there is disaster impact, followed by response, rehabilitation, reconstruction, mitigation, preparedness, disaster impact, followed by all this. And then the general measures of preparedness will be, you have to not use the telephone too much, because you want to leave the lines for people to communicate. You have to leave the telephone lines free. Listen to the messages that are broadcasted on various news media, and carry out the official instructions that have been given. Whatever the authorities are asking you to do, you have to follow the exact same instructions that are being given. They will be given, instructions will be given via radio or TV or via loudspeakers. If the media has, if there is a power cut and you can't get the, digital media information, the loudspeakers will be used to communicate, and you have to follow the exact same instructions. Keep the family emergency kit ready. The people have to keep the emergency kit ready. And now let us see, if there is a fire accident, what people have to do before the fire accident happens. They have to instill the fire alarms or smoke alarms, and they have to practice the escape drill. They have to know which exit to take and which window to break, and which path will they follow as and when there's a fire emergency. They have to do a drill so that everybody is aware of the exit plan. And windows should not be tightly nailed, and they should not be sealed. So you have to keep the windows in a way they can be opened and closed in case of emergency. and you have to plan an escape ladders if there is a multi-storied building. Escape ladder, emergency exit and escape ladders have to be planned. Now what is done, inflammable items gasoline and inflammable liquids should not be put indoors, and they should be stored in appropriate containers in well ventilated areas, and the people should be instructed not to smoke, and no smoking boards should be put up where these inflammable materials are stored. And if there is a fire accident, what to do when there is a fire accident. If the person's clothes are catching fire, you have to educate them to stop running and moving too much, and they have to drop onto the floor, and they have to roll so that the fire will be put off by that maneuver. And they have to be crawling under the smoke, because smoke will rise up. They have to crawl under the smoke, and they have to somehow reach the emergency exit, and close doors behind you as you escape, to delay the spread of the fire. So they have to close the doors behind them, and they have, once they are safe, they have to stay out and not try to enter the fire scene again to save others. What to do after the fire? They have to if the person himself is a burn victim, then they have to approach a health facility, and if they detect heat or smoke, they should not enter the building, and they have to evacuate it immediately. And what smoke does is, it is causing damage to the lungs, and it is causing damage to the brain. It is causing drowsiness. Carbon monoxide is present in the smoke, which is causing asphyxia, and it is causing the person to go drowsy, and it's causing painless death, which is called a sweet death. Now, let us look at the next major disaster, earthquakes. It is nothing but shaking of the ground caused because of breakage or shifting of the large sections of earth, rock, which is under the earth's shell. And uh, aftershock, we can see that smaller earthquakes will happen after a major impact of earthquake. Many small earthquakes will happen, which are called as aftershocks. These aftershocks are actually causing more damage to the buildings which have already been weakened by the major impact, or the first earthquake, which was major. So aftershocks will be happening, and they can be present for several hours, days and weeks after the actual earthquake. And before the earthquake, what the people have to do is, the precautions should be taken while building the construction of the building, so that all the norms are followed, and build in according to the urban planning regulations, and ensure that your building is being constructed as per the laws and norms. And the just before the earthquake happens, the electricity and the gas has to be turned off, and prepare the family emergency kit. And during the earthquake, people who are indoors should move to the center of the building, and they should stay calm and not panic, and they should take shelter under heavy furniture, so that if the wall falls, they will be protected under the major furniture. And people who are outdoors should stay away from heavy objects, especially collapsing walls. They should stay away from those, as well as stay away from vehicles. Now, once the earthquake happens, people should be educated to check themselves if they are hurt, and also give first aid to the people who have been hurt along with them. And they should wait for the emergency medical services to arrive. They should not panic, and they should listen to the radio, and they should not try to move the people who are very highly injured. They should not turn on the electricity or the gas cylinders, and they should not touch the open electrical wires. And all the pet animals should be unleashed, so that they can move around. And you should help the authorities to take up the disaster response activities. Then the next disaster that can happen is toxic fumes and gases. Beforehand itself, the people who are at risk, they should know the evacuation plan, and familiarize themselves with signs and emergency alarms, and equipped for indoor and window tightening. And because there's a toxic fumes outside, they should know how to seal the house, so that the fumes don't enter the house. Emergency kit has to be put in place, and telephone lines should be left free, and listen to the radio and TV. Carry out the instructions that are given by the authorities, and you have to seal all the cracks and gaps that are present in doors and windows. And ventilators and should be turned off, or they can be closed. After the emergency, authorities' instructions should be followed, and household chemical emergency, all the chemical substances that are present in the house, you should not put them in a place where children can access them. And if they are inflammable, you should not put them indoors and put them in a well ventilated area or tightly sealed containers. And these are some examples of hazardous household items. They can be cleaning products or indoor pesticides, or they can be automobile products, and then lawn or garden products, and uh, inflammable, anything that is inflammable. Those are all the hazardous items. And if there is a household emergency, then uh, you have to stay upwind and away from the residents to avoid the breathing toxic fumes. Wherever there's a leak of that chemical or a fume, you have to stay away from that particular fumes or toxin, and get out of the residence. They have to immediately move out of the residence, and they should not waste time in collecting the things that they might need, but they have to immediately exit that particular building first. Now, everybody knows what is a tsunami, and it's a serious, enormous wave. It is created by underwater disturbance that is either caused because of a volcano or a landslide or an earthquake, which is happening under the water inside the ocean. And the water is moving hundreds of miles per hour, and it is hitting the coast. And so before the tsunami happens, the instructions will be given, evacuation will be called for, and people have to adhere to it. And they should not stay anywhere close to the coast where the tsunami can have an impact. They have to be away from the flooded area after the tsunami happens, and they should not hastily return back to their residential area or to the flooded area, because they will hamper the response activities, as well as they will be exposed to a lot of contaminated water, and they will fall sick. And they have to be remaining away from the debris, and the people should prioritize saving themselves and their health, not their prized possessions. Then the personal protection in case of floods. Emergency kit has to be kept ready, and flood. They should know if their area is low lying and if it is having a risk of floods. So whenever there is the in emergency, alerts given, they have to evacuate those areas. And local media, they have to listen to the radio and all of that, and teach the children also how to take care of themselves when there is a flood emergency. And flood proofing of the homes have to be done. There's something called as sandbag dikes, so they have to build a wall in the flood situation, where the water doesn't flood into the house. So this is how it looks like. The sandbags are used to build a dike, which is also called a sandbag diking. And floods evacuation steps have to be followed, prevent the water contamination. If there is a flood, drinking water should be protected. If it is contaminated, again diseases will spread. Basement sewage connections, those have to be taken care of. And electrical power, disconnection of all the electrical gadgets, and switching off the main power to the house has to be done, because electrocution can happen because of the water, flooded water. After the floods, do not return to the homes until the authorities tell the people to do so. Wait until the place is declared free, and the water is declared free, safe for drinking. And you have to disinfect all the rooms that have been flooded with flood water, and disinfect all the utensils and dishes in the kitchen that were touched by the flood water, and get rid of the food that has drowned in the flood water. And get rid of all the consumables that have been packed and sealed for a long time while the floods were happening. So these are the things, and this is about the disaster management chapter. The whole chapter was covered in this particular lecture. And I would again want to reinforce that you have to know the disaster definition, the hazard definition, types of man-made and natural disasters. Then you have to know the disaster cycle. The steps in the disaster cycle are disaster response, preparedness and mitigation. Then you have to know what is tagging, what is triage, and you have to know what will be the health education you will be delivering to the people if there is a disaster, before the disaster, during and after the disaster. So you can have a exam question saying you are the medical officer responsible for a disaster response camp, and there was an earthquake and this is your population, what would you do? So all these things have to be taken care of, and you also have to know how are you managing the resources that are pouring into the camp after the disaster happens. You have to, you know, receive them, store them, and you have to transport them and distribute them. All those things are also responsibilities of the medical officer. So if there are any doubts that you might have after listening to this lecture, or anything that you might want to ask about this particular disaster management chapter, you can always approach me in the department, and I can help you out. Thank you.